The notorious transition from 2D to 3D that a lot of platformers made in the mid to late 90s is a topic that I feel like every content creator that covers retro video games is required to talk about at least once. It is a topic that has been talked about to death at this point, but to be fair, it was a very exciting moment in video game history that was also equally terrifying for video game companies who previously only had experience in making 2D platformers. Some companies succeeded in the transition with flying colors, while others, not so much. So with that being said, it is impressive that in 1999, Ubisoft went from this to making what is, in my humble opinion, one of the best 3D platformers out there. But how did they manage to pull this off? Well, it all started in early 1996, when Rayman 2 entered development as a 2D platformer. This version of the game got surprisingly far into development, with some magazines even reporting that it was entering the late stages and was slated for a release date of autumn 1996. But this original plan for Rayman 2 would abruptly change once the team was exposed to Super Mario 64 and gameplay footage of Crash Bandicoot at E3. Seeing these games, the team feared that if they didn't hop on this trend, then they would quickly become irrelevant. So they had to make that switch to 3D. The problem? Ubisoft never actually made a 3D game before, so they had absolutely no idea what they were going in for. And given that this was a sequel to a game that received a fair bit of praise, they had to approach this very carefully. Their solution to this was to begin working on a smaller project, which of course is the subject of today's video, Tonic Trouble. Or rather, Head as it was originally called. Actually, the game went through several name changes during its pre-development phase before finally landing on Tonic Trouble because of an online contest. Anyways, Tonic Trouble was conceptualized by Rayman's creator Michaël Guarné. Supposedly, the game was being developed for the sole purpose of testing out the 3D engine that Ubisoft was planning to use for Rayman 2, Open Space, also known as Central Programming Architecture. This was all revealed in the book
L'histoire de Rayman.
Sometime around 1997, the game's development was handed over to the freshly opened Ubisoft Montreal. Yes, the Ubisoft Montreal, the same studio that now brings you AAA titles such as Far Cry and Assassin's Creed. Their very first project was essentially an overglorified tech demo for Rayman 2. Both games were being developed concurrently, but Tonic Trouble was scheduled for a much earlier release date, which was the tail end of 1997. But the project would end up getting hit with multiple delays, presumably because Ubisoft Montreal at the time was filled with employees who had little to no experience in game development. This was because the city of Montreal was trying to recover from the collapse of its manufacturing industry, and in order to provide more job opportunities, the government had the plan of turning the city into a multimedia hub. When they caught wind of the fact that Ubisoft was showing interest in opening up a studio in Montreal, they came in offering as much support as they could. This came in the form of paying Ubisoft $25,000 for every person hired. A very appealing deal, but it came at the cost of the studio taking in a lot of underexperienced workers. Thankfully, the team was split between these new recruits as well as members from Ubisoft Paris who would help guide them. So it's not like Tonic Trouble is being developed by complete newbies, but still, knowing how hectic game development can be sometimes, I can imagine this wasn't exactly the most ideal work environment. Sometime around 1998, Tonic Trouble was previewed at E3, where an IGN author reported that the version shown at the event was in a very rough state. The game suffered from frame rate issues, stiff controls, and an overall lack of polish. It wouldn't be until August 31st, 1999 when Tonic Trouble was finally released for the Nintendo 64, just 2 months before Rayman 2's initial release date. Then on December 7th that same year, Tonic Trouble was ported over to PC. For this video, I'll mostly be sticking to this version of the game, not only because it's what I'm most comfortable with, but also there aren't too many differences between this and the N64 version. Really, the biggest one is the opening cutscene. In the PC version, it's fully animated and voice acted, while on the N64, it's a mix of real-time cutscenes and text dialogue. It's also significantly shorter, to a point where it almost seems like Ed, our lovable protagonist here, is a completely different character. He actually seems kinda respectable, he's got some gumption, and has got the right amount of zaniness to him as well. Unlike the PC version, where we see him as a lonely spaceship janitor reciting a cheesy love poem to the girl of his dreams, only to get his ass nearly folded by said girl's boyfriend. Ed barely manages to escape and retreats into a maintenance closet where he finds an unlabeled can of liquid to wash away his sorrows. Turns out the liquid is radioactive or something, and it causes random things to mutate or become sentient. This freaks Ed out, so in a frenzied panic he disposes of the can and it falls down to Earth, where it lands into the hands of an alcoholic Viking named Grog. Upon drinking the can, Grog gains immense power and becomes hell-bent on taking over the world with this new liquid, which has already done irreparable amounts of damage to the environment. Ed is now sentenced with having to retrieve the can and reverting Earth back to its normal state. Off the bat, I just want to say that I love the visual presentation here. Like, this entire cutscene just reminds me of old school Pixar, and it makes me wonder why they never attempted to do this again for any of Rayman 2's ports, since that game is so narrative driven and cinematic. Cutscenes like these would have really given Rayman 2's mature story an extra bit of oomph. Not like it really needs it though, because it's still fantastic regardless. Even outside of the cutscenes, Tonic Trouble still looks amazing. It's so vibrant and has got Ansel's unmistakable imaginative style. It really seems like this game was almost his creative release, an empty canvas to just go wild with the art direction, and compared to Tonic Trouble's successor, it makes for a nice refreshing contrast. The first level you're thrown into is one long sliding sequence. Ooh, I'm getting a little bit of deja vu. This sort of serves as an introduction to all the collectibles you'll be running into. You've got golden Eda heads which function as 1-ups, thermometers that increase your max health if you pick up 10 of them. Fittingly, your health pickups are droplets of mercury, which is interesting. And there's the antidotes, or bonus points as the game sometimes likes to call them. I guess their name doesn't matter, but just make sure you always pick these up because they become really important later on. I cannot stress that part enough. Oh hey look, there's Rayman! After this, you're tasked with rescuing the Doc, a mad scientist who's capable of building a contraption to get you into Grog's castle, the contraption in question being a catapult. Once you rescue him, your main objective for the entire game is picking up different parts for this catapult in every level. These can range from something as mundane as springs to something as nonsensical as piggy banks. You would think that since you're collecting stuff, the levels would be more open and reflective of what's traditional for collectathon-styled games, but that's not really the case. The level design here is pretty similar to that of Rayman 2's. Very straightforward, lots of narrow corridors, not a whole lot of open spaces. When it comes to collecting these parts, it's not the worst because most of the time you do just run into them. However, if you happen to miss one of them, it really sucks having to backtrack. If you're lucky, the collectible is only a room behind you and you don't have to do anything super complicated to get to it. But there are also quite a few points of no return in these levels, and if you happen to miss out on a collectible in one of these, unfortunately the best thing you can do in that situation is to finish the rest of the level, get out of it, and replay it from the very beginning to get to that one spot you messed up on. Also, unlike its successor, there's a much bigger emphasis on puzzle solving in Tonic Trouble. However, I personally think this part of the gameplay is about as sloppily executed as its light collectathon-styled elements. I honestly don't have much to say about the puzzles here, they're all kind of bland and forgettable. It doesn't help that some of them are exactly the kind of stuff you've likely done in a dozen other games before. I almost feel like Ubisoft wasn't actually interested in exploring this kind of gameplay and instead did it just to make Tonic Trouble stand out a teensy tiny bit from Rayman 2. Either that or resources at Ubisoft Montreal were so limited at the time that it prevented Tonic Trouble from reaching its true potential here. Whatever the case may be, it's a bit of a shame because if there was a little more time and focus put into fleshing out this puzzle-solving gameplay, I personally think it could have easily allowed Tonic Trouble to stand on its own 2 feet. But unfortunately what we're left with is a bog-standard platformer trying to masquerade as something more. Most of the puzzles that you'll be doing here are centered around one of the tools you'll unlock in your arsenal as you progress through your journey. You start off with a stick, but it's not just an ordinary stick you use for whacking enemies, it can also be used as a makeshift lever or a control stick for moving platforms. Eventually it gets upgraded so you can use it as a blowgun to deal with objects both living and non-living, as well as a pogo stick to help you traverse through hazardous platforms. I gotta give them some points for originality here. Seeing as how Ed is an alien, I thought they'd give him some cool spacey gadgets to mess around with, but I guess there's just something about a regular ass stick that they thought seemed way more fitting for him. You do unlock other abilities too that aren't limited to the stick, like before you enter the 3rd level, the Doc upgrades your bow tie so you can glide through the air. Honestly, at first I thought this ability was a little stupid because I was like, okay, they're shamelessly ripping off their own work at this point, come on, it's another limbless character that can glide in an unconventional way. But then I thought about the fact that this game was made for the sole purpose to test Rayman 2's engine, and that's when I realized they probably did this just to see if the engine could even handle a character flying through the air. It's handled a bit differently too, it's not as easy to pull off wherever, and it takes a lot of getting used to. But once you get comfortable with it, it does feel nice to breeze through an entire part of a level. There's also another ability that is just downright bizarre, and that is Chameleon Powder, which allows you to shapeshift into enemies or random objects. And it's not nearly as cool as it sounds. It's not like you could do this on a whim whenever you want. It functions a lot more like the context-sensitive pads from Conquer, where at a very specific spot you can transform into a very specific thing, allowing you to solve the puzzle that you're on. It's super situational and you're hardly ever given any chances to actually use it, and when you do, it's only for a few seconds. Every so often, you might also run into a Nestle vending machine. Upon interacting with it, Ed will chomp down on a block of chocolate and turn into Super Ed. Oh yeah! In this state, he can do all sorts of crazy things like bend metal bars. And bend more metal, yeah, they never really do anything interesting with this. I think this is another difference between the PC and N64 versions of the game. You see, in the N64 version, instead of Nestle, it's Newman's Popcorn. It's kind of funny too, because they never changed any of the references to popcorn for the PC version. I'm guessing the deal between Newman's and Ubisoft ended pretty close to the last minute, making it hard for them to change everything like character lines just to accommodate for a new product placement. It also makes me wonder what Ubisoft currently feels about previously associating their name with a company like Nestle. At the end of one of the last levels, a part that you need gets snatched up by this evil magic mushroom dude. Your new objective now is to collect 160 of those squiggly antidote things that I briefly mentioned earlier. When I first got to this part, I couldn't help but just groan and roll my eyes at it. It's not even that bad, like the game's not asking you for 100% completion, and because of the linear level design on top of you having all of your abilities unlocked at this point, it's not that hard to find these things, but it's so annoying how this is such an abrupt roadblock that hits you out of nowhere. All this time I treated these things as fun little currencies to pick up, like the coins from Super Mario, you know, things that you don't really need but are there if you want them, and that's because the game doesn't do much to enforce just how significant these things become later on. Their counters don't give you a total for every level, the level entrances don't say anything. If you want to know about all of that stuff, it's hidden in a menu you can access by pressing F1, which isn't even listed in the keybinds. Other than that, the characters very occasionally mention it, but it's so brief that I don't even think you can blame me for forgetting about this. And in the end, is it even worth it? I don't know. If you felt bad for Ed at the very beginning of the game, well, he does finally manage to score once you defeat Grog, so there's that, I guess. All in all, Tonic Trouble's not a terrible game, but it's not all that great either, if I'm gonna be honest with you. It does certain things exceptionally well, most notably the visual presentation. However, the gameplay leaves a lot to be desired. It doesn't help that so much of this game is reminiscent of Rayman. Really, I don't think there's a single video about Tonic Trouble on this platform that doesn't mention the similarities between this and its sister IP. It's undeniable, there are a lot of them. And I mean, it does make sense. Tonic Trouble was made to see what Ubisoft's engine would be capable of doing for Rayman 2, but this came at the cost of Tonic Trouble struggling to find its own identity. It tries to be a puzzle platformer, but it doesn't really do a good job at it. It tries to be a collectathon too, but again, it doesn't really succeed at that either. As much as it seemingly tries to stand out from its successor, it's still hard to ignore the fact that Tonic Trouble just feels like a missing link between Rayman 1 and 2. It is the game's biggest weakness, while at the same time being the most intriguing aspect of Tonic Trouble. But, okay, I think I'm starting to get a little ahead of myself here. While I did say I was mainly going to be sticking to the PC version because there aren't really any noteworthy differences between this and the N64 version, there is actually one other version of Tonic Trouble that I haven't mentioned, and that is the Game Boy Color port. Yes, there is indeed a GBC port of Tonic Trouble, which was only released in Europe. Who asked for this? No one, probably, but of course Ubisoft went ahead with it anyway for reasons we may never know. Much like how Tonic Trouble was the first project Ubisoft Montreal ever worked on, Tonic Trouble GBC was the first project that the company RFX Interactive would work on as well. Unfortunately, unlike Ubisoft Montreal, I don't think RFX had the luxury of their team being split with seasoned professionals, because Tonic Trouble GBC is quite rough. In fact, I struggle to even think of a single positive thing to say about it. My biggest issue with it by far is the level design. Most of the levels here feel like an abstract mess of moving platforms that go all over the place. It's so hard to gain any sense of direction because of this. Simply getting to the exit can feel like a mission sometimes, never mind the fact that you still have to worry about the catapult parts here. I feel like I can never rest easy with this game. Always at the back of my mind I'm thinking, did I really get everything or am I missing something? And I won't ever truly know until I get to the final boss of a world and see that, yeah, I did in fact miss a collectible. Now I gotta go through the last 3 levels and find that one spot that was just slightly out of the camera's view, that one spot I skipped over because I didn't know where I was going, or that one dastardly spot that the developers thought would be a good place to stick a collectible in. Another weakness this game has are Ed's abilities. You have almost all of them besides his glide ability, however there is not a single button you press to switch between them. Instead, you have to pause the game, select the ability you want equipped, unpause the game, do whatever you need to do, pause the game, go back to your normal stick mode, unpause the game, and keep going until you need to do this process all over again. There are entire boss fights where you're seeing this screen more than the game itself. Now, to be fair, with the amount of buttons the Game Boy Color has, I don't really know how else they would have been able to work around this issue, but still, constantly having to do this gets annoying pretty quick. And something I don't understand is why they made Ed's melee attack so pathetic here. Seriously, it's almost useless with how slow and short-ranged it is, compared to the enemies you'll be going up against who can just constantly batter you. Ed's attack becomes an even bigger issue when the game expects you to deflect projectiles with it. The timing on this is so off that I'm almost convinced this thing is entirely up to a coin toss and not actually dependent on how precise or accurate the player is. Really, the only good thing I can say about Tonic Trouble GPC is that at least you don't have to worry about collecting antidotes, but that's about it. The only reason why I wanted to talk about Tonic Trouble GBC is mostly just to make you all aware of its existence. Plus, I think it's kind of become my thing recently to talk about various versions of one game, even if some of them are as stinky as this. Now, before I wrap this video up, I think it's absolutely necessary to talk about one more version of Tonic Trouble, which is Special Edition. What's so special about it, you might be asking yourself? Well, this version of the game was released, or rather distributed, about a year prior to the final product hitting store shelves. It is a sort of beta version of Tonic Trouble that was bundled with computers, graphic cards, and supposedly cereals too. Now, I really tried looking into why Tonic Trouble Special Edition even exists, because I find it a little confusing that Ubisoft would publicly release such a rough draft for what was an upcoming game at the time. I wasn't able to find anything conclusive, only bits and pieces that gave me a vague idea of what likely went down. I think Special Edition was some sort of a marketing strategy, not only a way to give players a taste of what's to come, but also a way to check player feedback. Which makes sense considering how many times Tonic Trouble was delayed. Special Edition was a good enough draft for a limited public release, so Ubisoft could see how much more work needed to be done on the game before it would get a full retail release. It's kind of surprising. I expected Special Edition to be more like a demo with 3 or 4 levels, but this is the entire game. What's even more surprising is that the levels here are completely different from the final version, at least the ones that I've played. I have to admit, I haven't finished Special Edition because there are parts of it that feel borderline unplayable. After about 2 hours, I just had enough. Like I said, this is a very rough version with a lot of imperfections. I've said that the level design in the final version doesn't really work well for the light collectathon styled elements that the game has, but it works so much better than whatever was going on in Special Edition. The levels are still linear, but they're also huge to an almost unnecessary degree. It felt overwhelming sometimes seeing just how massive some of these levels are and the amount of unused dead space they have. After playing this, I gotta say the developers made the right choice shrinking these down a good bit for the final version. But the biggest elephant in the room when it comes to Special Edition are the controls. Unlike the final game, which has the standard analog controls that we all know and love, Special Edition has tank controls. Oh boy. It's actually not as bad as I thought it was going to be, although it does suck when the game is asking me to do some quick, precise platforming. But I find it interesting because in an alternate reality, this likely would have been the exact same control scheme that Rayman 2 would have had. For those that don't know, Rayman 2 was also originally supposed to have tank controls as well, but after playing Super Mario 64, Ansel pushed for analog controls. The rest of the team felt iffy about it because at the time analog controls still haven't become the standard, but thankfully Ansel managed to persuade them and, well, the rest is history. I should mention that there are versions of Tonic Trouble that are even older than the Special Edition. One that really managed to catch my eye was a 1997 build of the game that was only shown off in the trailer. About a year ago, there was a small dedicated effort in trying to track down this build, but unfortunately it seems like it was unsuccessful. The link to the project's Discord server is invalid, and I haven't been able to find any updates. But I'm hoping I could bring some awareness to this so that one day we could finally get our hands on this fabled 1997 build.
Here comes.
As flawed as Tonic Trouble is, I won't lie, the further I look into its development history, the more I find its legacy to be rather charming. A lot of the game's issues likely stemmed from the mostly underexperienced team that Ubisoft Montreal had. But despite that, I think this was the perfect beginner's project for the studio to work on, especially when you look at the games they developed after this. It has been stated that in its infancy, Ubisoft Montreal was mainly tasked with making licensed kids games, in order to avoid any serious business risks while the studio was still trying to train its team. These types of games were not only easy to make, but also sold regardless of their quality. When you take that into account, it kinda makes sense why they were given Tonic Trouble, a game that was only made to test a 3D engine. It was the perfect set of training wheels for a freshly opened studio. And let's be real here, from the very start, I don't think Tonic Trouble was ever going to do well. It was doomed to be overshadowed by Rayman from the get-go. Though with that being said, there was some interest in making a sequel shortly after the game's release that would have been titled Tonic Adventure, but this never became anything other than a concept. Regardless of Tonic Trouble's success, or lack thereof, it's undeniable that it left quite a significant footprint on not just the Rayman franchise, but Ubisoft as a whole. Even though it's one of Tonic Trouble's biggest flaws, I do have to admit it's kind of fun to pick at all the little building blocks it has that would later get reused and refurbished for Rayman 2. It's especially cool to see how the theme for the Level Glacier cocktail here was basically recycled for Rayman Origins 12 years after Tonic Trouble's release, which is crazy to me. If it wasn't for this game, we would have gotten a very different Rayman 2, one that probably wouldn't be nearly as successful. Along with that, the franchise likely wouldn't have lasted as long as it did. And say what you will about Ubisoft Montreal now, look, I can't exactly say I'm a huge fan of the newer stuff either, but it is impressive how far the company has come, and this is how it all started, with a clumsy little game that would help build one of the best 3D platforms of the 90s, and a studio that now has a strong foothold in the AAA market.